Hey guys, Scarlet here. I hope you all are doing well today. So I have two videos coming at you this week because I'm just feeling optimistic and excited and I want to share some more stuff with you guys. So thank you all so much for commenting and sharing my previous video that I did about witches and the devil. It seemed like you guys really enjoyed that discussion. So for today, I am going to be talking about the pagan influences in Lord of the Rings. So what specifically inspired Tolkien when he was writing Lord of the Rings? And before I jump into that, again, I just want to give you all a big hug to my returning subscribers. Thanks for coming back and watching another video with me. And for anyone new here, welcome. I post weekly and sometimes bi-weekly videos about tarot, paganism, and magic. So if those are topics you are interested in, do please consider hitting that subscribe button down below. So let's jump into it. So I am going to be talking about Tolkien and his influences when writing Lord of the Rings. Now, the first thing we need to think about here is I'm going to be talking about the pagan influences. But Tolkien himself really described Lord of the Rings as a Christian story. So even though there are a wide variety of pagan influences within Lord of the Rings, he himself, Tolkien, was very much a Catholic. And he once described Lord of the Rings to one of his friends who was a Jesuit father, and he described it as a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So I'm going to be a bit sacrilegious here, picking out all the different pagan pieces, because at its core, Tolkien really did believe that this represented a Christian narrative. He also talked about how underlying Lord of the Rings are the idea of a battle between good versus evil, a triumph of humility over pride, and also the concept of grace in the way that you see Frodo's pity towards Gollum. So he really did believe at its core this was representing certain Christian ideas. But this is a video about the pagan influences, so we are going to dive into those. And first thing I want to mention is that Tolkien was heavily influenced by Norse mythology. And during his education at King Edward's School in Birmingham, when he was young, he even started to read and translate from Old Norse in his own time. So not only was he inspired by the myths, but also the construction of the Norse language. And that probably helped him later develop Elvish and some of the other languages in Lord of the Rings. And then later, when he was a professor and teaching at the University of Leeds, he founded a club called the Viking Club, which was an informal gathering of philologists and fellow historians who specialized in the Germanic and Scandinavian languages. And members from this Viking club would meet regularly to read the old Icelandic sagas, medieval poetry, and the various Norse myths. We also know that one of Tolkien's first Norse purchases was the Volsunga saga, and I apologize for these pronunciations. But this saga really provided some of the basis for Wagner's opera series known as The Ring. So if you are familiar with Wagner and The Ring, you know that the story, The Ring, the opera, it really influenced Lord of the Rings. So both The Ring, the opera, and later Tolkien's story, The Lord of the Rings, was very much influenced by this saga. And this saga does contain a particular magic golden ring as well as a broken sword that is then reforged. And a lot of the names that you'll find in Lord of the Rings also come from this particular saga as well. Another thing I want to talk about is the character of Gandalf. And Gandalf was very much influenced by the Norse deity Odin. And Odin is so much more than a Norse deity. He's also this wider archetype within literature, within movies, within our cultures. And he is kind of the archetype of the old wise wanderer. He is the man with the long beard. He's got his wide brim hat and of course his staff, which functions both as a walking stick and as a magical item. So this archetype that you see as the wanderer is really most times in literature and movies tying back into the Norse god Odin. And Tolkien himself, in a 1946 letter, admitted that Gandalf was influenced by Odin, and also that he viewed Gandalf as this Odinic wanderer, and that much like Odin, Gandalf promoted ideas of justice, knowledge, truth, and insight. Another fun thing from Norse mythology is the Balrog. So we all remember the Balrog, right? And the Balrog is influenced by a fire Jotun named Surtur, and Surtur foretold the destruction of the bridge in Asgard. And we all know in the movie, when you see the Balrog, of course there is that bridge that Gandalf falls upon. So there's a lot of interesting parallels, and here I'm just listing a couple from the Norse sagas, but there are a ton of fun references. Another thing that I just want to briefly bring up is the movies and the way that they look. And you'll notice when watching the movies that the architecture, the art styles are also hearkening back towards pagan traditions. Especially the giant mead hall in Rohan. It really does look like a Viking mead hall. And so that's fun too, as you're watching the movies, to pick out some of those artistic influences that are coming from pagan religions. So in Lord of the Rings, there are a variety of different species, and two of those are elves and dwarves. And two sources that contain a lot of accounts of elves and dwarves that Tolkien drew upon were the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. And a lot of what we know about Norse mythology also comes from those two sources. And within the contents of the best known poem of the Poetic Edda, the creation of dwarves predate the creation of man, which is a similar formula to what Tolkien used when writing about Middle-earth. And you get a ton of names as well, such as Gandalf and the dwarves from The Hobbit, coming from the Poetic and the Prose Edda. Also, interestingly, Finnish mythology plays a role in Lord of the Rings, and specifically the Finnish national epic known as the Kalevala. And in a manner similar to Lord of the Rings, the Kalevala centers around a magical item of great power. In this case, it's called the Sampo, which bestows great fortune on its owner, but never quite makes clear what its exact nature or intention is. So you can tell that Tolkien really drew a lot of inspiration and influences from Norse mythology, Germanic mythology, and Finnish mythology. And that not only was he fascinated by the stories and the tales, he was also really interested in the construction of Old Norse, the language, and used that to help him, inspire him in the creation of his own languages that he creates for Lord of the Rings. So how do we reconcile these two kind of contradictory aspects? On the one hand, Tolkien himself believes that the story of Lord of the Rings is at its core representative of his Catholic faith, but pretty much all of the symbolism, all of the visual imagery, the names, the stories, the tales are mostly inspired by stories and tales coming out of the pagan societies in Northern Europe. So when I was thinking about that, it came to mind about Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is a psychologist, and if you are familiar with tarot, you might be familiar with the idea of like the collective unconscious. Carl Jung and his ideas about our subconscious and collective unconscious really intermix with a lot of esoteric ideas and philosophy. So I was thinking about the collective unconscious and how that might have played a role with Tolkien and his creation of Lord of the Rings. And I was also reading this book here recently, The Return of Odin, the Modern Renaissance of Pagan Imagination. And there was a quote in here talking about Carl Jung and the collective unconscious, and I want to read it to you because I think it can provide perhaps some insight into how Lord of the Rings is an interesting combination of Christian and pagan influences. So in this book, it writes that Carl Jung developed a more general belief that the ancient mind was still alive in modern man, albeit hidden and suppressed. He also thought that this ancient mind represented a deeper and more authentic European spirituality. Much of his professional and personal life was dedicated to bringing this pagan legacy back to light in order to make it conscious once more. Underpinning Jung's psychological system was the belief that Christianity was responsible for the symbolic content of only one layer of the European mind. Beneath it lay another level that was pagan and could show its presence through spiritual imagery that was pre-Christian in origin. So that concept of layers of the mind really resonated with me when I was thinking about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. On this one level, you do, of course, have Tolkien himself and his Catholic upbringing and his belief and worldview, excuse me, within this Christian context. But perhaps underneath it, simmering, was this collective unconscious, connecting him with his own ancestors, with his own pagan ancestors in the stories of old pagan Europe that somehow bubbled up a bit when those creative juices were flowing, and that helped inspire and direct his creation of Lord of the Rings. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this video. I am not a Tolkien scholar by any means, so I do apologize if I made some missteps here and there. I just find it so fascinating to look into some of our more popular and entertaining movies, stories, and videos and kind of see what are those pagan stories that are coming through. So again, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you do like topics like this, do please take a minute to hit that subscribe button down below and hit that notification bell, and that will really help me out a lot. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.